I am John, a writer. Writing was once my only talent, until one day I realized that the convenience of technology had surpassed my abilities. Initially, I just used AI to handle some tedious editing tasks. Then, it started giving me inspiration, and eventually, it took control of the creative process of my works. I thought this would allow me to create my masterpiece more freely and quickly, but I was wrong. That day, the computational power suddenly collapsed. The neural networks of technology were instantly paralyzed, and the familiar routines of life descended into chaos. Dog-walking robots stopped working, and the streets were full of dogs running wild. At the restaurant I frequented, the once precise cooking system began boiling eggs in an endless loop, with smoke constantly rising, as if it would never stop. In the gym, treadmills went haywire, trapping countless people on them. As the machines sped up uncontrollably, screams echoed throughout the building. The world became absurd, like a scene from a runaway farce. Yet for me, the real horror wasn't the external chaos, but the collapse within. I could no longer rely on AI to generate my works. That familiar digital assistant could no longer solve all my creative problems. I sat in front of the keyboard, my fingers stiff and powerless. The inspiration that once flowed so freely had vanished, and my creativity came to a halt. The keyboard felt cold and unfamiliar, as if mocking my helplessness. I used to think that technology was an extension of my creativity, but now it had become my greatest shackle. At first, people thought it was just a temporary glitch, but the collapse of computational power lasted for days, weeks, until everything ground to a halt. Computing power had once been the cornerstone of our society, and now it had disappeared. People started to frantically scramble for the remaining computing resources, and those with even a small amount of power quickly became the new holders of authority. The world fell into chaos. Former creators, scientists, and artists were now desperate competitors, fighting for a scrap of computing power. All creative activities stopped. Cities began to decay. Both technology and culture seemed to vanish overnight. Computing power had once been the invisible pillar of our lives, and its disappearance brought our world crashing down. I watched as people went from trusting in computing power to becoming obsessed with it, and finally, utterly dependent on it. They started to see it as the only salvation, with computational resources becoming the most valuable currency in this crumbling world. Human creativity and the ability to live independently had long been eroded by computing power, and now civilization had come to a standstill. In the midst of this chaos, I used the last bit of computing power to complete my final piece of writing. I finished it, then sealed it away. This is my legacy. When the collapse of computational power is complete, this work may never be read again, perhaps buried forever in this age of disorder. The consequences of the collapse are irreversible, and this piece has become my final legacy. The computational power and technology humanity once relied on have retreated like the tide, leaving behind only devastation.